Hey, what's going on, guys? My name is Dan. Welcome back to another book club. I think this is our third one. We're reviewing The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People by Stephen R. Covey today. And I have here Ashley with me. And she's going to help me review this. She marked up her book. She has some questions for me, and I have some questions for her. So we're going to talk about the book. Awesome. So what's your first question? What do we got here?
So I think it's appropriate to just start with the first section of the book that is kind of an overview of the 7 habits, and it really sets you up to go in with an open mind, and it's called Inside Out. So really just changing your perspective, and you actually look through different lenses and different perspectives as you read the book. So I just want to know what you thought about that section, and also the graphic of the woman. What was your opinion about that section?
A graphic of the woman specifically, or?
Yeah, and just overall the section, how it's like setting you up to have a different perspective and
Yeah,
the graphic that it features.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I think the graphic of the woman, definitely check out the book so you know what we're talking about. But I think oftentimes, right, when we go into situations or when we just live our day-to-day lives, we only see our own perspective, and we only see kind of what we see, and we rarely ever see what other people see. And, I think that specific graphic helps us understand that, there are different perspectives out there. There's different paradigms out there. I think that the first section about Inside Out is definitely about shifting our paradigms or shifting our perspectives. I think it's more specifically about getting us to recognize the importance of our character ethics, our principles, and our values, and shaping habits around those principles and values, and making sure that when we're living our day-to-day lives, if we truly want to be effective, happy, contributive, valuable, etc., that the characters that we have are the intentions that we give off. And these intentions more than likely are going to be the factors that lead to the results that we have, right? So one of the diagrams in the Inside Out, or that it talks about, is that, intentions lead to behaviors lead to results. And oftentimes, when we talk about the intentions and the behaviors are our personality, like what we actually do as an individual. And when we're trying to adopt habits, when we're trying to change ourselves for the better, etc., we oftentimes just focus on our behaviors because we believe that our behaviors will dictate what the results ultimately end up coming out as. But what Dr. Covey really tries to help us see is the importance of the intentions, because ultimately what changes behaviors are the intentions, how we perceive those behaviors. So we're able to really go down to the core of ourselves and change what our intentions are, what our characters are, what our values are, what our principles are. Then it'll be much easier to reflect that in our behaviors and ultimately get the results that we want to get. So I think that's kind of like what I thought was really interesting about it. When I was actually recording the book chats themselves, for the longest time, I didn't know what paradigm even meant. And I actually read Inside Out 2 or 3 times. And then, even then, I really understand what paradigms meant. But then it was only until I started reflecting and writing about it, then did I really have a better grasp of what paradigms meant. And I think it really just means our intentions. I wish he just said that, but he doesn't. But then I think when I read it again, that he kind of did. So maybe I'm just a bad reader. But I guess what are your thoughts about the Inside Out? And I think how does that relate to the idea of the golden egg example or the golden goose example?
Well, first, my thoughts on the Inside Out. I think that it is very challenging to reflect on yourself because, that's the whole point of a reflection, is you don't see yourself quite how others see you. It's easy for me to look at somebody else and judge them because I can see their full self, their full character, how they're acting, how it makes me feel, but you don't really realize what you're doing to people and how it makes them feel. So that's why he really wants to like set you up in the inside out. Like you really need to step out of what you think you are, because maybe you don't think you are a certain way. Maybe you don't understand yourself like you think you do. So, and then as far as the golden egg, he just talks about having a good balance basically between your assets and then what is produced by your assets. And I kind of looked at that like, you know, how can I apply that in my life with relationships and with work, just all aspects of my life, my religion, that you have to have a good balance of maintaining that asset, that person, that relationship, as well as, you know, what comes out of it. Because if you neglect one of them, then you're not going to have anything. So, yeah, that's kind of what I thought about the golden egg. What about you?
About the golden egg specifically, or
Yeah.
So I mean, the golden egg example is about the balance between production, like what you produce, and production capacity, and your ability to keep producing and stuff, right? And you know, Dr. Covey gives a couple of different examples. There was like a physical example, like a car, right? The importance of maintaining your car, maintaining your house. Then there's like the financial example, right? The example of making sure you're not taking on like crazy debt because interest adds up, etc. And, you know, not being able to use that money for other things that could lead to better investments is a bad use of that money and stuff. And then he talks about like the personal aspect of it, like making sure we're taking care of ourselves, we're acknowledging our employees or acknowledging our customers, etc., and making sure that we're treating people and treating ourselves in a way that is going to lead to more production in the future without destroying the capacity or the capability to continue to produce. You know, I think it's a balance, right? And I think that the balance for everybody is different. The ability to produce versus the ability to recognize when you're burning out, recognize when you need a break, recognize when there needs to be an oil change in your car, aka yourself, get some sleep. That's all dependent on you as an individual, and there's no like set formula for that, right? And I think that's why it's so important to look into our values, our intentions, and our principles, and reflect and understand where we are as individuals, and understanding kind of how we need to take care of ourselves and what taking care of ourselves really means. So that's kind of I mean, obviously don't kill your production, don't kill yourself, because when you kill yourself, then it's donezo. But I think for everybody, it means something a little bit different. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. And then habit 1 talks about things that are in your circle of concern and your circle of influence, basically the things that you can't control versus the things that you can control. So how does that apply to your clients and your students when you coach them and the reflective journaling that they do?
Yeah, sure. So I think with a lot of the people I work with a lot of people that have anxiety, depression, and suicidal ideations. And I think that one of the important things to acknowledge about those specific disorders is that there is an overwhelming, overbearing feeling of loss of control. And generally, it starts out with anxiety. And when we look at anxiety, it's specifically the disorder itself. It's when it drastically or dramatically or impactfully affects our lives, where there's so much constant worry or so much constant running back and forth in our heads that we are unable to function. We're paralyzed by our anxiety. And oftentimes, the paralysis comes from our inability to address some of the things that we're anxious about. And the important thing to recognize when we're dealing with anxiety is that the concerns that we may be very, very worried about, some of it may not be something that we can control. And one of the important things to do is to reflect and recognize what part of our anxiety, what part of our worry is not within our control, and what part of it is within our control. Because I think that, at least based off of my experience, the best way to move forward from anxiety is to take action. Any small incremental step of action leads us to be less anxious because there's proof that whatever we're worried about is changing and we're able to change it. And there's like an empowering feeling with that part that helps alleviate a lot of the anxiety. And that all comes down to recognizing like, hey, like, is this within my control or is this not within my control? And being able to just make actions on the things that are within your control and slowly be able to recognize that there are things that are out of your control. And for those things that are out of your control, instead of the usual thing, I think a lot of people often say, hey, like, don't worry about the things that are out of your control. But like for anxious people, like that's like the worst thing to say. Like, don't worry is like just telling them like, you know, you're anxious, you're being annoying. What I like to think about, and then the perspective that I like to have is that for the things that are out of our control, think about what actions we can actually take to make them in our control. If we take a common one as in like, you know, are you performing like performance anxiety? Are you performing in any relationship? You know, it could be with your partner, it could be at work, it could be at school, etc. Let's take the school example because that's like the most general one that I can think of. A lot of the times, you know, students end up freaking out about their exams when they get, you know, close. And they're not sure, like, are they studying correctly? You know, they start worrying and they start thinking about, well, I don't really understand this. What am I going to do? And oftentimes, like, there's not much that's within your control about what you don't understand. I think that like one of the things as a tutor, I used to be a tutor before this, right? I always ask my students like, what do you not understand? And some of the kids that I work with, they would say like, if I knew what I didn't understand, I wouldn't be here right now. I would know how to solve my problem. And I think that the action to that concern is go talk to somebody that understands what you don't understand. Right? If you don't understand how to do this calculus problem, then go talk to your TA, go talk to your professor, etc. Take an action to like fulfill the thing that you're worried about that you have no control over. If you don't know what's on your exam and you have the study guide, but the study guide makes no sense to you, go talk to your professor. Because that's one of the only things that you can do to address that anxiety. So you have concerns, you have what you can control. Think about for the concerns, what are the things that are within your control that can help address those concerns and take action towards it. It's hard. It's hard not to be paralyzed by anxiety. But the first step is to actually write down what is causing you anxious and write down what you feel like is within your control that you can do to address that anxiety. Because, you know, it's not about not worrying about it. It's about doing something about it that will help with the anxiety. Is that
Yeah, and I think like
sense?
writing it down, like also just to kind of like elaborate on that, it talks about it relates to what we were talking about earlier, just being able to like see your thought process, because if it's just in your head and you keep it in your head, you might not even understand it. But, you know, like he said, if you write it down, then you can really kind of have that inside out perspective and really understand what you're thinking, why you're thinking it, and then come up with the solutions to hopefully help with the anxiety and whatever you're worrying about.
Yeah. I took way too long to explain that. I'm sorry, guys. So in Habit 2, they talk about like the different ways that you can center yourself and center your purposes in life, right? One what did you think about the different ways we can center ourselves, and what did you feel really resonated with you?
So when I first kind of was going through the chart, it's like work centered, spouse centered, church centered, and the list goes on. And I was kind of like, there might be a mix of things, but I didn't really resonate with one specifically until I turned the page. And he talked about being principle centered. And by no means, I don't have myself figured out in all of my principles. It's a very challenging thing to like really reflect on yourself like that. But I just think that I do try to honor my principles. So that's what he kind of talks about, is just really understanding who you are and staying true to that. And if you are money centered for whatever your reasons may be, or any of the other centers, it's okay. You just have to really understand that and feel strongly about that. And your life choices and what you do should reflect what you truly value, or else you're not really living out your full purpose and you're not really living intentionally. So that's kind of my takeaway from habit 2. What about you?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think one of the more important things to like really emphasize on is that our principles can change as life like kind of goes on, right?
Yeah, for sure.
I think like when I was younger, I used to live in not so good areas. There was a lot of gangs around, a lot of shootings around, and there was a lot of like insecurity, not just with food, but with safety, with security, etc., that happened. And that taught me the importance of education, that taught me the importance of work ethic, that taught me the importance of working in order to make sure that there is a future for those that I care about. And then that was like always very work centered in my brain. And then I kind of got to a good place, right? And then my principles begin to kind of shift, right? And I recognized the shift. And honestly, when I started recognizing the shift, I was not sure what to do. And I'm still shifting right now. I'm not really sure, like, okay, what am I supposed to focus on? What is important? And I think it's important to recognize that as we go through life and our principles begin to shift, and as I'm becoming more family-centered, more partner-centered, more kid-centered, because I have a kid now, all these different aspects become different than what they were before. And as these principles begin to change, it's important to like take account and reflect and think about like, how does that really affect what we feel like is our purpose and our mission in life? And ultimately, like, are we okay with that change? Are we feeling like this is the right thing? And oftentimes, like, even if we feel like this is the right thing, at times it doesn't feel like this is the right thing. To speak to all the workaholics out there, it is hard, dude. It is hard to say that, like, I'm going to stop working at a certain time to spend time with my kids or my girlfriend or partner, etc. It's hard. And at times you're just like, well, if I don't work, how are we going to go eat good food? Or how are we going to go on vacation? Like, how do we live in a house? How do people have all these things without busting their butt off? It's all very, very challenging to begin to shift our principles and our perspectives and what we hold as important, what we hold as like makes us happy. And I think that, what Dr. Covey talks about in habit number 3, putting first things first, is this principle about weekly planning. And I think that, as an EF coach, I mean, I do a lot of planning with my clients and I do a lot of planning by myself as well. And we always do weekly planning, but he introduced something that I thought was very interesting and also very reflective and helps us reflect. My voice has died right there. Helps us reflect on what we really think our principles are. And he tells us, if you read the book, you'll know what I'm talking about, but he tells us to think about our weekly planning in terms of roles, like what roles we actually play. And I think as human beings, we have relationships, and we oftentimes we don't really think about these relationships as different roles that we play in our lives. Um, and planning our weeks via these roles helps us recenter ourselves and think about like how do these roles and these goals that I want to set for these roles move me towards what I currently think is my personal mission. And on a week by week basis, you can like constantly like doubt yourself as you're like coming up with these rules and you're coming up with your goals for these roles. And I think that's fine. And I think that it's important to like know that it's fine, that it's okay to not be sure of what the rules are, what the principles are, and what you really need to be doing. But I think what is a sign of like progress and working on, you know, our own private victories, what Dr. Covey talks about as our private victories, as better understanding ourselves, is to actually take the initiative and the proactiveness and the control to constantly think about what our roles are and what we're responsible for. I totally forgot what Ashley's question was. Just kind of went for a rant. I'm sorry about that.
It's okay. Well, I wanted to add on to something you said.
Sure.
You mentioned how, you know, it's like really important to be okay with the change and be okay with the principles in your life and how they change. And I just think that like that is so important. And I didn't even really fully understand the magnitude of that until you were just talking about it. But it's kind of like when you have a shift in your life. Like if you graduate and you're no longer a student, maybe you were so focused on being a student and whatnot, but now you have to shift that your priorities are now being a good maybe employee, or if you are an employee and then you become a parent and so you are focusing on being a parent. So it's just understanding that your principles will change. You can find value in a different way. So it doesn't mean that, or if you're a mom and then your kids grow up, it doesn't mean that you're not valuable anymore because, you know, you no longer have to be their mom in a sense, but you have to shift that principle and find what else is valuable in your life. So I think that, you know, that is super important, is to really understand like what's important right now and that it's okay that it changes.
For sure. And you all should definitely call your moms. I still talk to my mom like every other day. So don't forget your moms. They work very hard for you guys. For sure. So we talked a lot about like the private victories, right? The victories that we have within ourselves, and like those private victories are going to be like constant. We have to constantly think about those and work on those, at least in the sense of, you know, growing and developing ourselves, right? But then there's like the public victories. And I think like when I was reading this, I was like, well, do I have to like be victorious privately before I can become attempting the public victories? And I think that, you know, Dr. Covey doesn't really talk about this right off the bat, but I think that as he progresses through the public victories, he talks about the importance, and even in the very last habit, the sharpening the saw habit, he talks about the importance of constantly working on those private victories and how those private victories actually make the public victories easier. I think that the first habit, or the first public victory habit number 4, win-win situation. I thought there was one portion that I thought was very, very provided a lot of peace of mind when it came to win-win, right? I think that a lot of the times when we are discussing differences or trying to make compromises or trying to make negotiations or etc., we all come from our own perspectives and we all have differences. And oftentimes those differences can't be resolved because no matter how hard we try, sometimes it's hard to resolve differences. And he talks about something that I've never really thought about. I know I do it all the time, but I've never really thought about it, which is the idea of no deal. What are your thoughts about no deal?
Yeah, I thought it was really interesting, and I didn't even think about it that way until I read it. But he basically talks about how unless you have a win-win situation, you ultimately lose. And basically the no deal idea is that accepting that if it's not a win-win situation, if we both aren't going to succeed and get something out of this, then it's okay to not have a deal, because ultimately if one person isn't happy, like I said, you're not going to have a good outcome. So yeah, I just think that's really important to think about in life and in relationships. And I mean, just the first example I could think of is kind of like at work. If your employer wants certain things, but it doesn't make the employees happy, ultimately, that's not a good situation, because then the employees won't want to work there anymore, and the employer can't even get the results that he wanted or she wanted. So having a win-win situation and making sure that both parties are
talking about me.
No, I'm not. But making sure both parties are happy ultimately gives you the best results, and you guys can be a team. And yeah, so that's kind of what the no deal, how I looked at it, is be okay with, not having a deal if it's not going to make the other party involved happy.
Yeah, for sure. In multiplication rules, right? Plus times plus is always plus. If you got a negative in there, it's always negative. So if there's ever any negative...
That's my next tattoo. No, I'm just kidding.
If there's any negative approaches, no matter how strong that plus is, no matter how much positive intention one side has, if there is a negative intention on the other side, it's always hard to have any kind of win-win situation. I think that, at least for myself, when I was reading this section and thinking about the different types of like business negotiations that I have to do, I think one of the things I found that was most helpful is setting the intentions right. Is that like before we go into the conversation, that's a difficult conversation, we have to acknowledge that we're coming from a place that we want everybody to win and that there's enough wins to go around. Right? If we're going to talk about some sort of like complication with a marketing client and they're not happy, we're not happy, there has to be some sort of ultimate discussion prior to the main discussion of like why we're unhappy, to say that, hey, we both want to come out of this like happy and like satisfied with the work that's going on. So let's figure out how that looks. And then take the time to like exercise habit 5, which is, understand before being understood. And I think that one of the aspects that I don't think people really acknowledge, right? Because everybody always kind of views it from their own perspective, is that when we actually take the time to understand and listen, then it tells the other side that we actually care, that we actually give any hoots about them and what their feelings are. And no matter how much people say we got to keep emotions out of it, keep it business, keep it professional, we got to keep emotions out of it. Humans are emotional human beings. Like, we're emotional in nature. And when we don't take the time to understand and acknowledge and show that we care, then why do they have to show that they care about what we care about or what we even have to say? So I thought that was really, really, really significant, because I was really thinking about, well, like, whenever I go into something, I'm always trying to think about like leveraging and positioning and like all this stuff, and how I can come out of it at like winning. And never do I, since before I read this book, never have I really thought about, well, how do I start the conversation so that we can both really win? And even as I was reading the win-win situation part of the book, I was having a really hard time grasping, well, how does that conversation even start? Because it's a hard approach to have a win-win situation. It's hard because it actually takes a lot more effort than just saying, screw it and walk away. So yeah.
Yeah, that's a good point. And that is something to give yourself credit for, that it is harder to work on things and to not just give up. So, if you feel like maybe somebody isn't working on themselves or working on something, just understand that it is hard, and ultimately I think if people didn't care, they would just walk away. So as long as some effort is there, then, you should take that into consideration, and that's valuable. For habit 6, which is about the synergy and how embracing your differences can really help you come together and be a stronger team. So what did you think about the synergy and how embracing people's differences can actually give you a better result than you even thought you could achieve?
Yeah, I mean, I think that we are capable, right? We're capable people, and capable people tend to feel like only they can do what they can do, um, and that everybody else can't do what they can do. And I would say that like I am at fault of that even now, and definitely for sure the arrogance was present in the past. Um, but I think that what we tend to forget is that we all have weaknesses. We all have things that we may not enjoy doing that other people may really enjoy doing. And working together as a team is all about finding out where the strengths and the weaknesses complement each other,
Yeah,
and
for sure.
making that synergy happen, even though like there's differences, right? Like, because a lot of the times, like, if we talk about math, right, 1 minus 1 is supposed to be 0 because they're different, right? But something about humans and something about the creative aspect of life and the creative aspect or the creative nature of humans is that even the difference of like 1 minus 1, it doesn't have to be 0. Like, differences don't have to collide and they don't have to cancel each other out. Differences can actually create something out of thin air. I think there's so many times where like, and I think maybe you guys can think about this in your own lives. How many times have you talked to somebody that is on the other side of the planet when it comes to a topic? And it may take forever, and there may be a lot of arguments back and forth, but then they say something that you're like, oh, wow, I've never thought about it like that. And then that leads to other conversations, and that leads to so much new and different things in our lives that we could have never imagined if we didn't form this potential collaboration. So I think there's a lot of magic that's involved in synergy, but I also think synergy is so difficult. It's so hard because it actually calls for us and requires us to be patient, to understand, to try to be understood. And the reason why I'm emphasizing to try to be understood is that oftentimes, like, especially in our own personal lives, we tend to just think that people around us that know us should really just like know us. Mm-hmm. And like, why do I need to explain all this stuff to you? But we have to try as well. Not only do we need to listen and hear, we also have to put in the effort to like try to help the other individuals understand where we're coming from. And, Dr. Covey talks about how when we work together and have synergy, there's this thing that is called the third alternative. And both the girls didn't like my analogy, but it's kind of like two ends or two legs of a triangle. And they're both on equal grounds, right? But they're different. But as we work together and climb the sides of the triangle together, we can reach this apex that is like by no means the sum of the equal parts. Maybe if it's like equilateral triangle, then sure, 1 + 1 = 2. But like, if it's any other triangle, an isosceles triangle, a scalene triangle, like any other triangle, when you work together, like truly work together, you can reach new heights. So I think that's the power of synergy. I think that's like the importance of synergy. And a lot of the lack of ability to synergize is has so much to do with just ourselves, has nothing to do with anybody else. And I think a lot of times we just like, hey, it's his fault or it's her fault, that things are not working out. It has nothing to do with me. I'm perfect. But can you imagine if everybody in the room thought like that? And in truth, then it's the leader's fault. Whoever is leading them, that's his fault for sure. But it's just about setting aside differences and working together and finding a way to figure out something that nobody could have ever imagined would be possible.
Yeah, for sure. And I think the whole theme of the book, when he's talking about being open-minded, like you really have to understand what that means to be open-minded and to not judge somebody for how they feel, because if you're judging them, then you're not being open-minded. You need to really just take it all in. And I know he talks about that somewhere about like listening, like your listening skills and just listening with the intention of understanding, not listening to respond or just listening by showing that you're active listening, but really listening to actually understand their point of view. And even with the previous habits, like I wanted to talk about, I just wanted to go back on, I think it was habit 3, when whatever center you are, if you're money centered or whatever, I think also an important thing to remember is that you just shouldn't judge people for their principles, how they're centered, because just like how you explained that you're money centered and the way that you grew up and why that's so important to you, you have to remember that people have their principles and values because of the own world that they're living in. So you don't understand that world. So you shouldn't judge people. And I think that all of these habits lead up to, the very end where he talks about like sharpening the saw and just maintaining this kind of like open-mindedness and always seeking to understand and always like looking for an opportunity to learn and to grow and accomplish great things and just to never stop trying to understand yourself and understand others. So what was your takeaway from sharpening the saw?
Habit number 7. I think habit number 7 is either worked on too much at times or not worked on enough. And let me kind of explain this, right? So habit number 7 is the habit of focusing on or spending time to focus on your physical, mental, spiritual, or social. This is for social health. And it's all about focusing on the things that are important to us, but not necessarily urgent or prioritized. And the reason why I want to say that sometimes there's 2 different types, right? Either you work on it too much or you work on it not enough. Is that, I think for all the individuals that are always in a rush, and the rush could be dictated by circumstances and conditions in life. It could be due to the work environment. It could be due to poverty. It could be due to personal like personality and stuff like that, where it's just so hard for them to like sit down and really work on the things that are important but may not be a priority, like exercising, like flossing, like taking a shower, like eating correctly, like reflecting or going to church, or I don't know, going to temple, stuff like that, right? All those things that kind of feed us and provide us with motivation. But then there's like, I think people that only do those things and maybe don't spend enough time on some of the urgent things. And so yeah, I think there's, even with sharpening the saw, there's like a very delicate balance of like knowing what you need and what is enough for you to be able to feel effective and like feel re-energized and energy and have like energy and stuff like that, right? Because sharpening the saw is all about making sure that you're staying sharp. He gives this analogy about how there's this guy cutting down a tree and he's like in a rush. So he only has like 3 hours to cut down a tree. Apparently maybe it takes like 6 hours to cut down a tree or something like that. So he has like half the time. So he ends up like starting to chop the tree. He doesn't sharpen his saw. But if he only sharpened his saw, he might have been able to do it at the 3-hour mark. But instead, he took like 9 hours or something like that. And so the principle and the habit of sharpening the saw is all about taking the time to refill your production capabilities so that you can keep producing. And whatever you're producing is up to you, you know? And for everybody, it's different. But for whatever you do, but you do produce, there's a need to take a break, and there's a need to reflect, and there's a need to take care of yourself so that you can keep doing it. And that's kind of what sharpening the saw is all about. And it kind of reflects back to like the very first like prelogue of the whole book, which is Inside Out, of focusing on making sure there's a fine balance between production and production capability. So yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So that's it. Cool. I need to use the bathroom, so I can't really think anymore. But thank you guys all so much for watching. If you like this video, please like and subscribe. We really appreciate it here at the EFC team. We are going to be reading Viktor E. Frankl's A Man's Purpose, or Finding a Man's Purpose. Finding a Man's Search for Meaning. I'm so sorry. I read that book so many times the last couple of days. I don't know why I'm butchering it now. It's totally embarrassing, but it's fine. Like it if you think this is funny. All right. Thank you guys. Bye-bye.
Bye.